starting the recording.
It's a racing on tracing.
Are all the tests the same?
Sorry?
You might just want to sell that and get something aftermarket.
Yeah, no, they're not all the same, but they're close enough.
Stage 3 clutch, flywheel.
It's pretty good.
Eagle F1s.
All right. Well, I'm going to get started with the test, with the test questions. And I think I will go start with the last one, question number 4. I think most people have, more problems with question number 4 than any of the other questions. And as the test is being passed around, I know you may not have your own test in front of you. So what I'll do is I'm going to type one of the versions on the screen. And for this one, the only difference was the name of one of the parameters. Okay, so it's not that much of a big difference between all the different variations. All right. So I'm just going to copy and paste it, onto the spreadsheet, and then we'll go from the spreadsheet. You don't really have to get everything done right to get most of the point. I mean, obviously, you have to get everything right to get all the points. But if you get the concept, you will still get most of the points in this case. So
I hope you're generous.
Well, the point is to assess whether you guys understand the concept or not. So that means you have to get the answer to a certain point to convince me that you understand some of those concepts. Do you guys have any questions? Nope, sorry.
Can I get my exam?
It's being passed around, so just wait until it gets to your turn.
Just a quick question. When can we expect these graded by?
I'm going to grade it over the weekend, along with my P310 class.
I'm just curious.
Well, I don't know where you're
The homework, the whole 9 yards. A lot of grading to catch up with.
These look like they would be really hard to grade. Looks like it would be really tedious grading.
With this one?
Yeah. Your exams.
Yeah, they're all open-ended questions, so that's why they're all a little bit difficult to grade.
Okay, talk to me about the SVT after class.
All right, so let's go ahead and get started. If you guys have any questions, I will be glad to answer that. But other than that, let's go ahead and focus on the answer of question number 4. Before we go any further, let me save the file. Make sure we don't lose it, because I think this one may be kind of important. So exam 2, question number 4. Other than the fact that it needs more space than the other questions, were there anything that was particularly tricky about this one?
Once you got
Nothing other than the tedium of the trace. Okay.
Once you got into sub S1, you started doing the multiple times over and over again. It was hard for me to keep everything straight in my head and on the paper.
Okay.
Next time, maybe a bigger piece of paper.
Bigger piece of paper.
Yeah, no kidding.
Like legal size, 11 by 17.
I don't think legal size would even help. I think it needs to be like that.
Legal size.
Because I have really big handwriting.
9 by 17.
11 by 17. That's a 2 letter size paper. Before it's cut. All right, so I'll go ahead and talk about the answer, and along the way, I will tell you what are the key concepts that I'm looking for when I'm grading. Each question has key concepts that I'm looking for. So in this case, it is passing by reference and the recursion. That's the important concept. So we start with the precondition line. There's nothing to say about the precondition because we don't have any global variables, which is kind of cool. So we start with line 15, and on line 15 it invokes stub. Okay, do you guys have any questions back there? Can I answer your question? Nope. Okay. So on line 15, we have to remember where to go back to. Line 15 is pretty easy because stub does not return a value. So if you want to use return info and say post, that's fine. But typically we just say return line number in cases like this. So return line number is fine. One person in this class asked me, he or she forgot to put a pound sign after the return line number, and I said, that's fine as long as I understand what it is, there's no problem. All right, so we set up the return line number, and there's one more column to set up because when you look at stub has a local variable y, so we have to return one column for variable y. But because it's a local variable, it does not start with any particular value, so we have to put a question mark there. All right, and now we are ready to go into the stub subroutine, starting on line 12. On line 12, not too much excitement is happening here because we just have to initialize y to 2. And then on line 13, we have to invoke S1 because otherwise we would not know what value to print when it comes back. So here we need return info because we need to know where we are returning to. We are returning to line 13, but more than that, we also need to know what else we need to do on line 13. Are there any questions up to this point? I think up to this point, for the most part, you can even copy and paste from some of the sample programs that we have done in the class. I mean, this is a really typical way to start up a program with most of the traces with subroutines. Yep.
Don't we need to establish the...
Yep, we need to establish the other columns. Because when we invoke S1, it has one parameter which is passed by reference. So now you need another column for X. Now X is passed by reference, which means it is a
Stargate.
It's a Stargate, very good. So because it's a Stargate, it is a portal to another column. So you have to say it is also known as column
D.
D in this case, exactly. Because I use local variable y in stub to specify parameter x in S1. So that's why when I set up parameter x in S1, it becomes a portal or an alias of column D. Yes?
What if I forgot to write a column and just D?
Just D?
Yeah, like AKA D.
AKA D? That's fine. It's understood. Especially if you have column names.
Yeah.
If you have column names, then it's fine. Yep.
What if I didn't write anything, but later on I showed that I did understand that it's my reference? I mean, later
Then
on.
you have to show me when we modify X that column D is the one that is
I
modified.
did end up doing that later on. In the
Okay.
question.
Yeah, but then the question is, how did you keep track of that when you did not put it here?
I just looked at it.
Magic.
Okay, magic. I'll take a look at it.
Okay.
All right. So now that we are done with setting up the columns, we can go into the subroutines, S1, and continue execution on line 3. On line 3, we have a condition to evaluate. The question is x less than 1 true or false? Now, x is also known as column D. Column D now has a value of 2. 2 is less than 1 is false. Okay. So that means we have to move on to line 6. Line 6 is going to decrease x by 1 and then it will evaluate x minus 1 and then store that result back into x. X is also known as column D. Column D is right here. 2 minus 1 is 1, but we also have to store the 1 back to here. So if I were to highlight the important parts of this particular question, this cell is important, this cell is also important. So I'm going to do some highlighting here just to remind ourselves what I'm looking for when I'm grading this particular question. Is that okay so far?
They use a darker color.
A darker color. Yeah, this particular monitor has a different response than other ones. Is that good? Okay. All right, so we are now continuing on to line 7. And I think this is the part where things get a little bit tricky because depending on your handwriting, you can take up a lot of space horizontally. Different people use different approaches. Some people just kind of wrapped around to the back side of this page, and other people attached an additional page. So it's kind of interesting. I'm pretty sure by the time I grade it, it will be very interesting because I have to find out, okay, where is the other part of question number 4? When I scanned it, I was trying to make sure that when I scanned it, that your attached sheet would be next to it. And I rotate everything so that by the time I grade it, it should be all kind of lined up. But we'll see. All right, so on line 7, the first thing we have to do is just set up return info because we have to get back to the same line to finish the rest of that line. Now here, there are 2 really important parts. We are getting back to line 7. The return is not done yet, but we are only replacing the first one with a question mark. The second invoke is not what we're dealing with right now. So the second invoke remains exactly as is. And that's why you are running out of space is because we have to write all this stuff here. So we have the invoke S1 again, X specifies X, just like that. Are we doing okay so far with how we set up this particular return info? And on top of that, we also have X to set up. When you pass something by reference, if you have a parameter that is passed by reference to you, and you're trying to pass by reference to somebody else, you only pass the reference itself along. You don't pass the reference off of reference. So that means this one is also known as column D. They have the same dial address, the same Stargate address to dial back.
Okay, so what if we did column F?
Yeah.
If you go back to column F, then points will be deducted because this is an important concept.
You never told us.
I thought he told us to go to column F, but chose to column E.
No,
Really?
I thought I said the reverse.
YouTube.
YouTube.
I'm gonna
Exactly.
YouTube this. I want to find this out.
Okay, well, YouTube it and let me know.
I thought since X was already allocated, it would.
Yeah.
Since X was already allocated, and you're passing by ref to X.
I think we saw this once, and I'm pretty sure I said, when you pass something by reference, the reference has to go back to the original item. You do not use a reference of a reference.
We're gonna find out.
Okay, go find it.
Yeah.
Go find it one way or another. Go find it because I
Spend hours.
want to make sure it is it one way or the other way.
Will it be minor points or just making more Stargates?
Yep, go ahead.
What if we just said invoke S1?
Sorry?
If we just put invoke S1 safe space, would that be okay?
Here?
Yeah.
Not really, because you have to remember what else you have to do on line 7. That's the whole purpose of the return info.
Right. I mean, I put everything else, but then I just where it says invoke S1X, ref X.
This part here.
Yeah, but invoke S1.
Oh, instead of not specify X goes to X.
Yeah.
I think that will be fine as long as by the time you get to the second one, you know what to do.
Right.
Okay. Yep.
I did the same thing as him, but I put even less. I just put INV because I'm way out of space. Would that be
Oh,
okay?
probably.
Because I have the question mark part, but on the other one I have INV instead of just both.
Without actually committing to this decision, I'm just saying that I will probably consider that okay.
Yes.
But this is not a commitment. Okay, I have to see what other people are doing too.
If it's not okay, then it's your fault.
You're starting to sound like my 6th grader. Very good.
Maybe he's right.
All right. So now that we have set up both columns, we can now continue to execute on line 3 again. On line 3, we have the same question. Is x less than 1? X is also known as column D. I guess I should be doing this. Column D now has a value of 1. 1 is less than 1 is false again. So now we have to go to line 6 one more time. Line 6 is going to subtract 1 from x. X is also known as column D. So column D is the one that has to be decremented by 1, which means it gets all the way down to 0. Then we go to line 7. Line 7 is the last time we have to invoke S1 in a recursive way. We'll have to invoke S1 in other ways after this, but it's not recursive anymore after that. So we have to go to line 7 and do another invocation. And I'm going to cheat here because it's easier for me to cheat when I'm using a spreadsheet. You guys could not do that because you were not using it.
We needed to.
spreadsheet.
Yeah, that would
All right. So this time it's the same way, because we are handling the first invoke of that line, and we are also passing x by reference to x, which is also passed by reference. So you're just passing the reference itself along, and you're not passing the reference of a reference in this case. We get back onto line 3 at the beginning of the subroutine. X is less than 1 is finally true because x is also known as column D. Column D has a value of 0. As a result, the condition is now true. When the condition is true, there's really not much to do. We go to line 4. Line 4 says return 1. Return 1 means we have to copy and paste the return info cell, and we only have one thing to do: replace the question mark with a value of 1. Nothing else. After line 4, we get out of the conditional statement, which gets us all the way to the end of the subroutine on line 9. On line 9, there's not much to do because we have to, actually there are two things to do. One is to remind ourselves where to go back to, which is on line 7. But line 7 now looks like this. And the second thing it has to do is to deallocate these two columns. In other words, you have to indicate in your submission that you are deallocating these two columns, even though we are going to reuse it, on line 7, right after we get back to here. Are we doing okay so far with this? So if I were to highlight, the cells that are important, these 3 cells are definitely important, because this is the first time we get all the way to the end of the whole thing. So you have to at least show me once whether you know what to do at the end of a subroutine. Okay. Are there any questions at this point? Nope. Okay. Now we get back onto line 7. Line 7 now looks like this. In other words, the first invocation is already replaced with a value of 1. So we only have to handle the second invocation at this point. So even though you still have to invoke S1 again, but this time the return info cell is going to be return 1 because that one is already resolved, and the second one is now replaced with a question mark.
Don't you have to do another ret info?
Return info on top of it?
Yeah. Make another ret info.
The header.
Ah.
Okay. And then we specify the same thing, 1, but this time the second invocation is replaced with a question mark. Parameter x is still the same way. It is also known as column D. So that part, that never changes because we are passing the same parameter by reference, all the time. Then we get back into the subroutine. The subroutine starts with line 3. Line 3 is checking whether x is less than 1. X is also known as column D. Column D at this point will remain 0 throughout the execution of this trace. So it will always be less than 0. So we say that is true. We go back to line 4. Line 4 is return 1. So once again, we take the return info cell, copy and paste it, change the question mark to a 1, and that's it. We do not simplify 1 plus 1 equals 2 at this point. Okay, so that's the other thing that is important. If anyone is simplifying this at this point, points will be deducted because that is not how it is going to be done. All right, are there any questions? After line 4, we go to the end of the subroutine, which is on line 9, and that part is pretty much the same way as last time. We have to deallocate both columns. Go to font effects, strike out, and then once again we go back to line 7. But this time when we get back to line 7 looks like this, which means at this point we are executing return 1 plus 1. There's no more invocation of any subroutine is necessary. We have all the values that we need. At this time we evaluate 1 plus 1 and say, aha, we know 1 plus 1 is 2, and then we say this is the same as return 2, and when you execute return 2, what you're doing is to replace the question mark of the return info cell with the value that you're returning. So this time we replace that with a 2, not 1 plus 1. Okay, when we replace the question mark, it has to be a specific value. Are we doing okay so far with this? Okay. Now this is after we execute the return statement. We are back to line. Excuse me.
Go to line 9 after that.
We're back to line 7.
Yeah, and then we go to
Yeah,
line
but how do we exit out of line 7?
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. This is exactly what happened to me. I just got a little-
Okay,
little
so
emotional.
after we execute the return statement,
Do the same thing with back to line 9, right?
then you have to get out.
Yeah.
No, we don't. We cannot get out because we have the second part at this
But how do we
point.
deallocate? That's what threw me a little. How do we
How do we-
deallocate?
I thought you did
the same thing
We
we
go
did.
back in and reallocate.
But the deallocation is already done here.
Okay.
So we are done with the deallocation. Now, okay, this is the part that I understand why there's a confusion. Let me make this a little bit wider so that we can relate what we are executing and what is the result of executing it. Okay, because we're getting back to that same question. All right. The question is, now we have several things that we have to take care of. One is, okay, let's get back to row 22. Okay, so go back to row 22 first. You guys doing okay back there? Okay, so we're going back to row 22 of the trace where we executed line 4. Okay, line 4, if you remember, or if you just read from your own test, line 4 is return 1. Now when you execute return 1, it's pretty easy, right? You locate the rightmost return info cell, copy and paste it, and then change the question mark to a 1. And that's exactly what we did. See, this is what we did here. We locate the return info cell, which was 1 plus question mark, and then we change the question mark to a 1. That's the effect of executing line 4. Is that okay? All right. After line 4, we have to get out of the conditional statement, which will get us all the way to the end of the entire subroutine. So that's why we end up on row 23 of the trace. We execute line 9. When we execute line 9, which is the end of the subroutine, we are returning from the subroutine. 2 things to do. One is to remind ourselves where to go back to. And we are going back to line 7. And that's why we have line 7 here on row 24. Is that okay? The second thing we have to do is to deallocate the columns, which is pretty easy. We deallocate columns I and column J. And now on row 24 of the trace, we're back on line 7. The question is, what does line 7 look like when we get back onto line 7? This one. Okay? In other words, at this point, we are executing this statement, and the effect is to change this to this.
Right. How do we deallocate?
But there's nothing to deallocate at this point.
From G and H, moving
From-
forward.
Sorry?
I'm sorry, I need you to shut up and let you go forward.
No, that's okay.
No.
We are not deallocating anything because this particular invocation is not done yet. We are executing this statement
Right.
in order to get to this effect. So we are on line 7. Now, when we have to get to line 9 first. Okay? Because we are done with line 7. So we go to line 9. Are we doing okay so far? Does everybody understand why we are done with line 7? We just executed line 7 like that one. That's how we executed line 7. And the effect of executing line 7 is to replace the question mark here with a 2. Is that okay? So we're back to line 9. At the end of the subroutine, we always do exactly the same thing. We look up the return info cell, and then we remind ourselves we have to go back to line 7, and then we deallocate those 2 columns. Is that okay? No?
No, I figured out where.
It's all right? Okay.
Thank you. Sorry.
So this part is important because we are executing this, and then we turn this cell into this cell. So these 3 are related. If I were to highlight it, this would be another point where a highlight would be useful. I'm trying to pick another color that is purple, magenta.
There you go.
That works.
Too dark.
Okay, we're not that
Just click off of it.
Light
doesn't-
blue.
Yeah, let's go white. White.
Yeah, so white highlight, that would be awesome.
What about light green?
Salmon.
Light
Orange.
green.
Orange.
How about light blue?
Light green.
Let's
this
just do
is
that.
fine.
That works fine.
That's
there
what
you go.
Okay, so these three are related because we are executing this one, on row 22, and the result is changing row 10 to row 24. Are we doing okay so far with that? Okay. So now that this is all done, I'm gonna scroll it back a little bit. When we're back to line 7, column G and column H are gone. When we get back to line 7 now looks like this. Are we done yet? Nope, we're not done at this point because we have another invocation of S1 to deal with. So when we get back to line 7, we are going to invoke S1 a second time. So now we have to reallocate this column because it was just deallocated, right? So now we have to reallocate it. And we have to remember to go back to line 7. The first invocation is already resolved to a 2, so we just keep the 2 here. And this time we are trying to resolve the second invocation. So the second invocation compared to the first one, compared to before, is now replaced with a question mark. And then we also have to specify parameter x. And parameter x, just like before, is still an alias of column D. After this, we get into the subroutine, starting on line 3. This part is fairly easy because x is, x is also known as column D, and column D is 0 at this point. So we put a 0. X is less than 1 is true because it has a value of 0. Column D has a value of 0 at this point. And then we go to line 4. Line 4 is return 1. Return 1 this time is going to change this cell so that the question mark becomes 1. Is that okay? Because we are executing line 4. Line 4 is return 1. When you return 1, you locate the rightmost return info cell, change the question mark to whatever value that you're returning, and you're done. After line 4, we get out of the conditional statement. And when we get out of the conditional statement, we get to line 9. Line 9 has 2 things to do. One is to remind ourselves where we're supposed to continue execution, which is on line 7. And the second thing it has to do is to deallocate the columns. So this time we are deallocating columns G and H again. And then we get back to line 7. But line 7 now looks like this, which means there are no further invocations necessary when we execute line 7 at this point because we know 2 plus 1 is 3, so this is the same as returning 3. When we execute return 3, we are locating the rightmost return info cell, which is column E at this point. Copy and paste it. Change the question mark to the value that we are returning. In this case, it is 3. And then we get out of the conditional statement because line 7 is inside the conditional statement. It was the last thing to do in that particular branch of the conditional statement. We get out, we get to line 9. Line 9 once again has 2 things to do. First thing is to remind ourselves where to continue execution, which is line 13. And then the second thing it has to do is to deallocate these 2 columns. And we can just copy and paste this part here because we still have info, return info, and x. And now we are back to the stub subroutine. We have a return line number, we have y. But do we know what we're supposed to print at this point? Line 13 now looks like this. And it is time to execute line 13, the print part of line 13. This is the last part of line 13 that we have to execute. It prints a value of 3 to the output, whatever is outputting, the screen, the printer, it doesn't matter. And after line 13, we go to line 14. Line 14 is the end of that particular subroutine. So we have 2 things to do once again. We have to go to the return line number in this case to remind ourselves that we have to go to post. And then the second thing we have to do is to deallocate the 2 columns that we allocated for that invocation. And we are done. So I'll be looking for a certain key concept. One of the key concepts is are we handling one invocation at a time? In other words, I want to see only one question mark here. I want to see only one question mark here. And then the second thing is, when we return, do we know that we have to replace the question mark with a value? So that would be what I'm looking for. And then I want to look for this as well. Okay, if there's one more invocation on that same line, do we remember to invoke it again to resolve the second one? Now in this case, you can see that the second invocation does not necessarily return the same value as the first one. Okay, in this case it does, but in the other case it does not. Because the first time it returned a value of 2, and then the second time it only returned a value of 1. And that's because I'm using x as a pass by reference parameter, and that dictates what kind of value the subroutine is going to return. Are we doing okay so far with this trace? So there are many pieces that I have to look for in this one, which is good and bad in a way, because it's good because when you lose points, you're not going to lose all the points. And it's bad because when I grade it, I have to look for all those things. But you already know how I grade your exam. I will have those things listed, and I will tell you what is the proportion out of that particular item that you're getting. Yep.
Is the fourth question worth any more points than the other 3?
No, it is not.
Okay.
And it is also the last question, instead of the first question, because if I put it in as the first question, then half the class will spend, half of the time, just tackling the first question, which is only worth 25% of the entire exam. And so I put the 3 easier questions first, so that you guys can basically get a warm up and just to get it started. And when you get on the fourth one, if you run out of time, it is still only worth the same amount of points as the first 3 questions. So you won't lose a whole lot of points just by running out of time.
Just out of curiosity, was there anybody that did not finish in time?
No, I don't think so. I think maybe some people did not finish the entire question number 4, but not by much. So. Yep.
If we forgot to put in pre, is that big?
I think at this point I'm not going to take out too many points for that.
No, I forgot pre.
Come on, man.
All 4 of my questions.
Really?
What have we been doing?
Well, at least I get points for free, right?
Yeah, I was like, we don't have the global variables, so we don't have the info
Right.
that
Still
needs
need
to
to
be.
put pre.
Yeah, that's why I didn't put any in.
Yep.
I got lines 8 and 9 mixed up because it was an end. So
You get 9.
you can take points off of that, like wherever you put number 9 in the trace.
Oh, you have 8. So every single place where we have line 9, you have line 8.
Yeah, because I just saw they both said end, so
Oh, you saw the end if, and then the end defines up.
yeah.
Probably not much. I'll probably just be focusing on what you write in the columns. All right. So are we ready for the other questions, or do you think the other questions are so easy it's not worth the
The
time
other ones
here?
are really easy.
Let's just do it.
I think this.
Let's do it one by one. Let's finish it off.
Yeah, pretty much.
Did you do the last one? Oh, okay.
I made a little note. I hope I at least get partial credit for this.
How about you?
I got it all about 3.
I got it all, but the AKA column, the AKA column F, D, and C.
All right.
you did it.
Let's go ahead and start with another question. Okay, which other question do you want to deal with? I mean, we're going to have to trace all the questions anyway, but which one do you want to do next? 3. Number 3? All right, so we're just doing it in reverse order?
Yep.
All right.
Didn't have to go very far.
Okay, question number 3, define sub Q3 I val N I val B.
That's question 2.
If B is-
Whoa, I'm like-
now this one has several variants, but they are all pretty similar. And info 3.
Myself in memory. Really?
I know. So it's like true, false.
All right, so this is question number 3. there are 3 variants of this, but they are very similar. And the only difference is the bound checking for V and also the initial value for 1. That's for V. Those are the only differences between the variants. All right, so let's fix the indentation. If I did not fix the indentation, then definitely if people see the and if and misunderstand that one as and defined sub, I cannot take points off.
Last one would have been tough if you didn't get any indentation.
Sorry?
Number 4 would have been tough if there was no indentation. That's weird.
I think in general it would be pretty hard without indentation, just about for any program that has structures like this.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go ahead and do this one. Make sure we save the file first. And this is our exam 2, question 3. All right, so we do have conditions to evaluate. So we need comments, we have line number, we have no global variables. So the precondition is pretty easy to state. We start on line 8. On line 8, we have to invoke Q3. There are no return statements here, so return line number is fine. So you can just say return line number. And for this particular call or invoke, we have to return to post because there's nothing else to do after this point. And then we have to set up the parameters. We have parameter n, we have parameter v. The first invocation is really easy because it states right here, 3 goes to n and 1 goes to v. So now we set up all 3 columns for the invocation. Any questions at this point? No questions? Okay. Then we go into the subroutine starting on line 4. Now on line 4, we want to do short-circuited evaluation, which means you only want to go as far as it needs in order to determine the result of the condition. In this case, let's do the first comparison. V is less than 6. Is that true or is it false? It's true. Can we stop here? Nope, because this is a conjunction. When one condition is true, the whole conjunction can still be false depending on the other conditions. So we have to evaluate the other one, n is greater than 1. Is that true? Yep. Okay, true and true is true. So that means we have to go to line 5. Line 5 is a recursive call. It calls the subroutine again. So this time we have to write down return line number. The return line number is actually line 7 in this case, because line 7 is the line that follows logically line 5, because we don't trace the end if line. I'm not going to take points off, when I read the trace, because in this case it's okay to say that when we're done with this, we're exiting the conditional statement. But typically we don't want to trace line 6 in this case. And then we have to set up the parameters n and v again. What should I use to set up n this time? 2, exactly, because the current n is 3, so the next one is n minus 1, which is 2. And how do we set up v?
3.
It is n times v, but the n and the v are both referring to the context that we are currently in and not the context that we are setting up. So we are talking about n being 3 and v being 1. 3 times 1 is 3. Is that okay? Once we set up the columns, we go back into the same subroutine on line 4 again. V is less than 6. Is that true or is that false? It's true. So we have to evaluate the other one. N is greater than 1 is also true. True and true is true. Then we go back to line 5. We have to do another recursion here. We have return line number. We have n and then we have v. The return line number is line 7 again. What is n this time? N is 1. What about v?
6.
6. Very good. So now we continue execution on line 4. This is where the short circuit evaluation becomes important, because we can say that this is false already. So we do not evaluate the comparison of n.
We did.
Then you have points deducted. Because if you read the test, the description of the test, the first part of it, I think it's right about in the middle part. In case of Boolean operators, and you put in parentheses conjunction and disjunction, use short-circuited evaluation. Evaluate an expression from left to right, but only up to the point where the result is known. So.
I mean, who reads the first page of the test, you know?
I was assuming that since you guys remember to put your name on the first page, you would probably read to the first page.
Not that smart. Come on.
But this is what we did in the class too. You know, we only evaluate short-circuit evaluation up to the point where the result is known. Not too many points, but it is an important thing. Okay, you know. Okay, when the condition is false, there's nothing to do, so we go to line 7. Line 7 has really nothing to do other than telling us to go back to line 7 again, and then deallocate the columns that we allocated for this invocation. So we just strike it out. And now we're back to line 7. Line 7 has the same thing to do this time. It reminds us that we have to go back to line 7, and then the columns should be deallocated. And now we're back on line 7 again. Same thing. It tells us that we have to go back to post this time. And then we deallocate the 3 columns. And then we get back to post, which means we're at the end of the trace. There's nothing else to do at this point. Yep. So I think, that the other 3 questions are short enough to make up for the last question. The short-circuit evaluation.
I wrote it in pencil. Let me change it here real quick.
Rescan it.
Rescan it.
Hackie's computer.
See, look, it's right.
That's fine. I have enough eraser marks that it actually be legitimate.
Next time I have to issue like special pencils with those nanotechnology traces. So every pencil is going to be unique.
We have to keep on erasing.
Like 24 hours.
Sorry?
You get the pens that you can erase for like the first 24 hours, and then it sets.
That's interesting.
That's cool.
All right. So which other question do we want to go first? What, the first or the second?
Let's go with the second.
Second. All right. So we're
Hate you.
This is very systematic. I like it.
That's the problem.
Well, we are in a program.
Yes.
Sure. By ref x, by val b, x gets b, and return b, and define sub, stub. Total x, oops. Y gets info assignment, x goes to x, 20 to 20. Okay, fix some of the indentations. Now this one, I'm hoping that someone will actually find this a little bit familiar. Remember, we kind of talked about how the assignment operator can appear anywhere in C. How many people still kind of remember that? That it has a return value itself. The assignment operator gives you a value in the end. And this is actually just a follow-up on that discussion. Okay. When we trace it, you will see what I mean by that. X2Q2. But even without that discussion, we should be able to trace this program either way because it only uses the concepts that we have talked about in the class, just in a very strange combination in this case. We don't really need comments in this case because there are no conditional statements and there's no print either. We can start with just line number. There are no global variables, so pre doesn't really have much to say. And that's why I think for this test, I would just not pay much attention to pre because none of the programs has any global variables.
Just so you points if we remember to put pre on there.
Seriously.
True. Maybe just half a point or something like that.
I'll take it. Yeah, I'll take it.
Half a point is better than no point, right?
Well, that adds up to 2 points overall.
If you remember, yes. Okay, we start with line 12. Line 12 invokes stuff. So we need return line number, and we also need the local variables x and y. Because they are local variables, they have unknown values to start with. The return line number is going to be post because there are no additional lines after line 12. Are we doing okay so far? I mean, this is fairly standard stuff. When we get to inside the subroutine on line 10, this is where things go a little bit interesting, but not really that much different from what we have talked about in the class. Look at line 10. There's an invoke in it. But when the invocation is done, can I just go to line 11 and say I'm done with this subroutine, or is there anything else I have to do on line 11? I have the assignment to do, right? Okay, so that means I have to use return info in this case, because when we are done with the invocation on line 10, there's some more stuff on line 10 to finish up. And that other thing that we have to finish up is the assignment or the changing of variable y in this case. But now that we are invoking assignment ASGN, we have to pass the parameters. One parameter is called x, the other parameter is called v. V is the easy one because it's passed by value. You just copy the value into that column and you're done. How about x? X is passed by reference. It is also known as column C. Exactly.
So on that, what if I put AKA it's y? Because I don't have columns on mine, column letters on mine.
In this case, since there's only one variable y of the entire program, I'll just take it as okay.
Yeah.
But when there are multiple y's, then I cannot tell which one you're talking about. So in this particular case, yes. Yep.
What if I put nothing, and once again I used the Stargate, later on in the program?
Say again?
What if I didn't put anything?
Oh.
And
you didn't even draw a little Stargate?
That would have been cool.
That would have been artistic license, extra points, right?
Yeah, except the Sci-Fi Channel may sue us, for
copyright infringement.
Change symbols.
If I draw 3 circles, that resembles the silhouette of a Mickey Mouse, I can get sued. Yep.
I put a comments line, and I put it as AKA column D, because all the columns are moved over.
Okay.
That's okay.
Well, you have to do it at the right place. So instead of column F here, is that what you did with the comments? Or?
Well, we had a comment.
Yeah, because
everything's just good.
On mine, that would be in column G, and it was just they were all just shifted over one. So it was in a comment.
Oh, they're all shifted over one, but it is there, right? AKA column C associated with X is there.
Yeah,
that'll be fine, as long as I can find it.
put a comment too.
All right, so now we get into the subroutine. The subroutine starts on line 4. Okay, what does line 4 do? Line 4 is an assignment statement. What is the right hand side of the assignment? Hello. Okay, what do we do on line 4? We evaluate the right hand side first. The right hand side is what? It's V, right? V has a value of 22, so the entire right hand side is just the value of 22. What are we doing with V? We want to update X with it. Yep, X is also known as column C, and column C is the one that gets updated to 22. Are we doing okay so far? And then we move on to line 5. Line 5 is a return statement. Do we know what to do with the return statement? Well, first of all, what is it returning? It's returning V. V has a value of 22, so it's returning 22. Once we know the value that we are returning, all we have to do is to locate the return info cell, and there's only one in this case. Copy and paste it, change the question mark to the value that we are returning, which is 22, and we're done. Then we move on to line 6. Line 6 is the end of the subroutine. 2 things to do. One is to remind ourselves that we have to continue on line 10, and then the second thing is to deallocate all the columns that we allocated earlier for this particular invocation. And now we're back onto line 10. But line 10 does not look like this line 10 anymore because the invocation is done. It is now 22. So we can carry out the rest of line 10, which is changing y to 22. So y, which is column D at this point, is also going to be changed to 22. And when we're done with line 10, we go to line 11. And line 11 is the end of the subroutine. Two things to do. First thing is to continue to remind ourselves to continue at post. And then the second thing to do is to deallocate the columns that we allocated for this invocation. And we're done. So this question really has no trick in it. It just has a weird combination of stuff, because typically we use pass by reference, or we have a return value. It is not very often that we have those two at the same time. But nothing says that we cannot have both at the same time either. So this is really just one of those cases where we have both, where the assignment operation becomes something that returns a value as well. Are we doing okay so far with question number 2? We're down to question number 1 at this point. So let's save this and deal with question number 1. Question number 1 is, question number 1 looks nasty, but it really is not. I had a hard time coming up with a alternative version compared to the practice exam. And this was what I came up with, which I think is resembling the practice exam quite a bit. So, it's okay. Yours may look a little bit different, but it still has pretty much the same stuff in it. All right. In the past, when when this class had exams, sometimes we have not the class is not big enough, so we can actually take the test over at the lab, and so people can use spreadsheets to do all the work and whatnot. And the number one complaint was, I wish we could do it on paper.
What?
When we do it on paper, the number one complaint is, I wish we could do it on the computer.
Why do you want to do it on paper? You're
I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding because I think at least in that particular semester, the way they set up the workstations, was kind of not entirely right. So the browser would crash. The browser would crash, and then there was another time. Go ahead. There was an.
Oh, I actually have taken your exams on both.
Yeah.
And like you said, when I was taking it on the computer, I was like, I wish I could take it on paper.
Yep.
And now I'm like, I wish I could take it on the.
Which one is better?
I'd rather.
Well,
take it on
we can have a
computer.
compromise. Next time we'll take it on tablets, right? Electronic tablets, not stone tablets. Yeah. New chisels.
They still should name the iPad the Isolate.
There was one time I remember this was really bad. We scheduled the exam in room 152, the main lab, for the final exam. This is not one of the exam 1 or exam 2. This was the final exam. We went over to the lab, and then on that day, the network switch had a problem. So the entire lab 152 had no network connectivity whatsoever. So we couldn't do the test over there. So we went over to 122. The next room is 122. It's a business tech lab. They have a lot of computers. So we thought, hey, that's okay. We'll just go to that lab. Except I did not save the seed or the original files in Excel format. I only saved it in ODS, the open document format. Microsoft Excel can actually open ODS files once you have updated it. And guess what?
Updated.
They were not updated. So I had to scramble, download all the spreadsheets, resave it in Excel as X format, re-upload everything, change the questions to have the additional link so that the students could take the test. It was a mess that particular time. It was a mess.
Stupid Windows.
All right, so let's go ahead and get started with this one. We have comments, we have line number, but there are no global variables. In fact, there are no variables whatsoever in this case, not even parameters. We start on line 13. Line 13 is going to invoke stub, and the return line number in this case is post, because stub does not return the value itself. And it has no local variables. So now we move on to the first line inside stub, which is line 11. Line 11 is going to invoke nest. But nest does return the value, and we have some additional stuff to finish up on line 11. So this time we need a return info, because we have to go back to line 11 to print out whatever the subroutine is returning. And then after that, we have to go into the subroutine nest, which is starting on line 8. And when we execute line 8, we definitely have a few things to do. In fact, there are 3 or 4 things to do depending on how you look at it. The first thing we have to do is to finish up invoke k, so that this becomes a value. The second thing is to invoke 2, and that becomes a value. The third thing is to do the multiplication, and then the fourth thing we have to do is to actually execute the return part of the statement, so that we can change the return info cell, the question mark of that particular cell. So now we get to line 8. We know that we need a return info. To get back onto line 8, the return is still there. The first invocation will be done, but the second invocation will still be unresolved at that point. Are we doing okay so far? Okay. And I think this part is similar, very similar to the one in the practice test. We go into the subroutine K, we get to line 2. Line 2 returns a value of 10, so we copy and paste the return info cell, change the question mark to 10, and then we go to line 3. Line 3 has 2 things to do. One is to remind ourselves where to go back to, which is line 8, and then the second thing is to deallocate the column. That. When we get back on line 8 doesn't look like this line 8 anymore, because the first invocation now has a value to replace it. We now have to handle the second invocation. The second invocation also returns a value, so we need to use a return info again in order to remember that we have to get back onto line 8. The first part is already done, so return 10 is still return 10. The second part, return 2, is going to be replaced by question mark, because I need a placeholder for the return value. And then we go to subroutine 2, which only has one line to execute, which is line 5. Line 5 is return 2, so we copy and paste the return info cell, change the question mark to 2, and then we go to line 6. Line 6 once again has 2 things to do. One, to remind ourselves that we have to go back to line 8. The second thing is to deallocate that column. When we get back to line 8 again, line 8 now becomes return 10 times 2. In other words, we are executing this particular statement, which ends up changing this particular cell to this one here. So once again, there are 3 cells involved. We execute we execute the statement as stated in 1 in order to change one cell to become the third one. Okay. So now we are done with line 8. After line 8, we have line 9. Line 9 is the end of the subroutine. Got 2 things to do. One is to continue execution on line 11 to remind ourselves that we have to continue at that point. The second one is to deallocate the column for this invocation. And now we are back onto line 11. But line 11 now looks like this. Print 20. So we can just go ahead and print the value of 20. After line 11, we get to line 12. Line 12 is the end of that particular subroutine. So we have to look up return line number. In this case, it tells us we have to go to post. And then we have no use of column C anymore. It is now deallocated. So, and then we continue at post. That means we are all done. Any questions about question number 1?
What if we did everything right, but somehow we just copied down the wrong number after so we printed the wrong number?
How wrong?
I mean, for some reason I wrote down 5 instead of 2 from some.
Oh.
The return value, I just wrote down the wrong value. Like as far as
If
going
you're
back through
consistent,
line
you know, if you're consistently wrong, you know, if you write
yeah,
down the
everything
wrong
matches
thing.
up. When I multiplied, I came up with 50
Okay.
instead of 20. When I printed the 50 instead of 20.
I have to take a look at that.
All right, yeah, I don't know why.
That may not be, but that would not be the key concept that I'm looking for. The key concepts would be like the deallocation of a column.
Yeah, all that stuff is perfect.
Okay.
That's exactly right. It's just it came up with the value that I wrote down the wrong value.
Okay.
All right.
Yep.
Okay, I came out with everything correct. Forgot to show that I'm invoking stuff at the very bottom. I know you started with 13. I started out with 11.
You started out with 11.
No, on the other one. I started out with 13 on row 3.
Say again.
Row 3.
Row 3.
I started out with 13. I started out with 11 on row 5.
So you started out like this?
Yeah, but everything came out right.
Well, that would still be wrong because the trace has to start from outside the definition of a subroutine. So I'll probably allocate like some points for overall correctness. So even if all the elements that I'm looking for are there, you know, there are still points that I can deduct because it is not entirely correct.
Yeah, I did the same thing. I didn't have 3 and 4. I started at line 11.
Yeah, that's kind of important to start with those, you know, because you have to know the entry point is, you know, the first line outside of the definition of a subroutine. Yep. All right. Anything else? Is this better than the first exam or worse?
Yes. Drawing the columns.
Pre and post
I think it's easier.
It's easier?
Yeah.
Number 4 was the only lame one.
Number 4 just took a while. We needed more paper.
Number 4 is a little bit long. Mm-hmm. Took out a little too much room. I can see that. Alrighty. So we're done with the second exam. You know, I have to grade it. So.
That's all right, because we had to take it.
But I have to grade it like almost 50 times.
He's like,
True.
This was
I'm tempted to grade, you know, like all the easier one first, you know, so that, you know, I can then focus on the harder ones.
I think that's fine, because then at least we get some type of idea on how we do on the test.
Well, no, I'm talking about, you know, this one is entirely right, this is entirely wrong, those would be the easy ones to grade.
Oh.
This one looks a little bit right, but it's not entirely
Good
right. We'll grade it later.
Procrastination.
All right, so we're getting back to types and records, and I hope you guys still remember what that was all about, you know, types and records.
Let's do it for purity today.
So are there any questions about, you know, the concept of a record? Remember the analogy? I think some people did not like the cookie cutter versus, you know, cookies. But I think it's a really good analogy because a cookie cutter does not use cookie. So that means you can define, you know, 20,000 record types in your program. When you execute that program, it doesn't use up a lot of memory. Or you can use a single record type, and because it's a cookie cutter, right? But if you use that cookie cutter to stamp out, you know, 20,000 cookies, then you will still end up using a lot of cookie dough because it is the cookies that use up cookie dough. It's not the cookie cutter itself that uses up resources. The cookie cutter is called a type, a record, a class, depending on the programming language that you're dealing with. The cookies are called objects, variables, local variables, parameters, depending on the language and the context. Okay. Are we doing okay so far with those concepts, you know, just the concepts? Doing okay so far? And what we have not seen up to this point is, can we have a record type that has a, you know, particular item inside that is also of another record type? The answer is definitely yes. So what we'll do is we'll focus on that concept today. You know, we only have about 12 minutes left, so we'll go ahead and just reconnect to the concepts that we were talking about before, and, you know, just so that next Tuesday we know where we should start. Okay, so we'll start with, you know, something that we are familiar with at this point. We have date. A date has a year, which is an integer. A month, that is an integer. Also a day of month, which is an integer as well. And record. So now I have just defined a cookie cutter with 3 particular items inside. Each item, you can call it a field. That's the traditional name of how we call Y, M, and D, is it is a field inside a record. I think those terms were borrowed from database concepts, because in database concepts we have records, and within a record we have fields which are components inside a record. The new name of these things in object-oriented programming is Y is called a member of date in this case. Okay, it's a member. Okay, a component is called a member, in the new terminology. So in this class, either way is fine. Okay, we sometimes call it an attribute, we call it a member, we call it a field. They all refer to exactly the same thing. Just like this, we can also define, a record type for time. Time, in human terms, how do we represent time?
24 hours.
Okay, so we have hours, minute, and possibly seconds.
You're not going to get any smaller than that, like milliseconds and nanoseconds?
Microseconds. You can turn second into a real number. Then you can represent, the fractional part of a second. So, but in this particular case, we just have to count all the way down to seconds. Okay. So now, what I want to do is to say, but what if I want to record, both the date and the time within the date, within a timestamp, okay? Because a timestamp, just like when you modify a file, or when you look at a file, it has various timestamps. It has one timestamp to say when the file was created. It has one timestamp that says when the file was last modified, and it has a third timestamp to tell you when the file was last accessed. So these 3 can be all different, okay? Because after you create a file, you can modify the file a few times. But after the last modification, you can still read the file a few times too. So these 3 timestamps can record different aspects or different ways that you access the file, during the lifespan of the file. But one timestamp is not just the date, it is not just the time, it is a combination of the 2. So that means if I want to combine those 2, I can have a new record type called timestamp. And in the timestamp, I can have the date part being of the date type, and then I can have the time part being a time type. So this is how things can nest basically within the definition of a record. Does that make any sense? That we can have nested record types. When you look at a real form that you have to fill in, do we have anything like this? When they ask you for your birth date within a form, that is by itself a quote-unquote mini form. Because in order for your birth date to make sense, you have to supply the year, the month, as well as the day of month. So that becomes kind of like a mini form within the big form, and we have something that is similar here. We have date being a component inside the timestamp, but that by itself is also a record type because it has its own components. This is a good time to kind of mention how a computer actually stores time or represents time. What is the problem with the human way of representing time, like year, month, day, and then hour, minute, and second?
Yeah, it resets every day.
It resets every day. The hour resets every day, but you can kind of look at it as just a digit rolling over. Okay. What type of things would be? Go ahead.
I feel like maybe it's because it's out of order. Like we like look at it out of order.
What about calculating the difference between 2 timestamps in this case?
2 based on 10 days.
How many seconds are between today and let's say March 3rd of this year, 10 o'clock?
You'd have to tell us what time it is.
Sorry? It's not very easy to figure out the number of seconds in between. Because you have to remember the number of days in a month, for one thing. And then add on top of that, you have to remember how many days, how many hours in a day, how many minutes in an hour, and how many seconds in a minute. I mean, we all know that stuff, but just looking at the date at a timestamp like this makes calculation a little bit longer. Okay, it takes a little bit longer to calculate. What if we are comparing two timestamps across years, and possibly have leap years in between?
It's even worse.
Anything that crosses year 2000 is kind of special because year 2000 is a leap year. What is not going to be a leap year? What is the next supposed leap year that won't be a leap year?
2100.
2100. Yep. Why is that? Why do we have these weird rules? Every 4 years is leap, every 100 is not, and then is it every 4 or 500 is again? 400 is again, and then there's another one that says it's not again. Why is it so irrational?
We're not exact.
Because the number of Earth rotation around one solar rotation is an irrational number. Just like the E constant for exponents, and just like pi, those are irrational numbers.
It's not just irrational; it's changing.
Yeah, in this case, it's also a changing thing because the actual amount of time changes too. Yeah. As we launch,
a quarter of a thousandth of a second or something.
Yep, the moon is also getting more and more distant from the Earth, which probably will affect the Earth's own rotation. I think it's about a fraction of an inch each year. The moon is actually moving away from the Earth.
Eventually we won't have a moon.
Eventually we won't have a moon. That is correct.
But it's not anything we have to worry about.
Well, I think it depends on when we'll because we're going to mine the moon at some point. So maybe we'll mine the moon into nothing before the moon actually has enough time to move away.
Or we'll have the technology to move it closer.
The thing is, if we start mining the moon, it'll lose mass and it'll start moving away faster.
Nope, not because its rotation is still at the same speed, so it's not going to move any faster or slower. Yep.
It's the physics.
My astronomy teacher said that the moon will actually stop at a distance it won't continue to move away. It will stop at the distance and only one side of the Earth would see the moon. The other side would never see the moon.
But we are already like that. The moon's own self-rotation matches the rotation around the Earth. The periods are the same. So that's why we are only seeing one side of the moon. We never see the other side of the moon.
No, I'm not saying we see the other side of the moon. I'm saying that
One side of the
How it orbits matches how the Earth spins.
the other side of
He's saying that its orbit will change to match Earth's rotation, so one side of
Oh, okay. So the moon's rotation matches the Earth's own rotation. So the moon will be constantly there, for a certain one part of the Earth, and then constantly not there. That will change the tidal, pattern quite a bit. Some animals gonna go extinct. I'm not kidding. Some animals rely on the tide, in order to survive. So, so if that changes, that would certainly be bad. Yep.
I got about 3.9 million seconds since March 3rd.
Okay. Very good.
That's a lot of seconds.
That's a lot of seconds. I think that may be a little bit too much. Okay, but getting back to the question, what do you think would be the best way to represent time when the computer has to compare, how many seconds is between this particular timestamp and that particular timestamp? Going through the calculations all the time is not impossible. Okay, the computer can figure out which year is leap, which one is not, how many months there are in each month, and so on and so forth. Is not a problem. But going through that calculation again and again is a waste of resources. So inside the computer, can anyone guess how time is represented?
Number of seconds since April 4th, 1970.
No. The concept is right, but April 4th would not be right. It's actually depending on the operating system. If you're using Windows, it is the number of seconds since 1980 January 1st midnight. If you're using Unix, Linux, or BSD, any type of variants of Unix, it would move back by 10 years. So it is the number of seconds since 1970 January 1st midnight. That's how time is represented in the computer. But then we have another question, because time is quote unquote relative, right? Because we have different time zones in the, on Earth, we have different time zones. So when we talk about 1970, January 1st, midnight, which time zone are we talking about?
Pacific Standard Time.
It's GMT. Greenwich Mean Time, which is also now known as UTC, Universal Time, what is the C? Something. It's a French word, okay? The French are very big on standards, and that's why a lot of standards are, in French. So UTC, no, that's not it. There we go. UTC, does it explain UTC? No.
Wikipedia. Wiki.
Right there.
Second down.
Oh, okay. It's Coordinated Universal Time.
UTC.
But in French, I guess they put the coordinated as the last word, so that's why it's UTC and not CUT. But the timeline, crosses London. I think, is it?
Yeah.
Is that right? That's why it's close to London. So the London time zone is the same as the GMT. All right. Well, I guess we are going to stop today's class a little bit early. So next time when we come back, we'll go ahead and try to figure out how to calculate the computer standard time using the number of seconds from a standard timestamp that we understand.
This is what happened. And I pointed out. I just copied 5. I'm assuming because in my mind I looked at line 5, and so I just wrote 5, the number 5, and the value that I returned.
Well,
but
since
it
it's
remains
consistent,
the whole
yeah.
way down.
Yeah.
So then the only thing that I did wrong on number 4, other than the reference of a reference thing, which I watch those videos a lot on YouTube, and I don't remember you talking about that one. But
okay, well, we'll go ahead and.
I skipped this line. I mean, whatever. That's fine. But I skipped this line. How bad do you think that's going to be?
That's not going to be bad. That won't be too bad because
it's one of the ones we talked about.
Because you got all the main concepts. Only have one single question mark every single time. And you resolve the first one, then you resolve the second one.
But coming back, that line is what I skipped there.
Yeah,
I actually
but
had it. And I just
here
erased
we
it.
have a little bit of a problem because we have 2 here, and then this should be 1. And the 3 is going to be a little bit of a problem. But you did end up printing 3 anyway, so there are just a couple of minor things, but I can see the main concepts are there.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Can you read that? I know it's really small.
No, I'm using.
No, this is not small. You mean the handwriting?
Yeah, I was just worried about
lightweight or supposedly lightweight.
No, I can read just fine.
And also, I kind of did the same thing. Since I already stated B is passed by reference, I kind of left it out on the second one.
Yeah, they are nice tires.
But
My dad's.
I don't have that much space, so I just put in book S1 down here.
Yeah, I tried.
Oh, it's a short hand. I think the shorthand fine. The shorthand part is fine as long as I can see that when you did invent it, you have column B's that have the concept of B and it's a
I've seen like I'm actually a mechanic. I've seen engines that were dusted from can filters.
First off,
right from
this one,
So
I did write that, but then I specifically noted that I shouldn't have. I
It's
just
probably not too
didn't
bad.
erase
It
it.
probably doesn't drive in dusty conditions. But I would change that out for the stock air.
Okay, if you're explicit and state that would be fine.
Okay.
Or the stock air box.
The stock air box would be.
It's hard to find in expensive.
Just
No, that there's a design flaw with the mass airflow sensor.
But first off, that 13
It
is supposed
causes
to be
it to
erased.
idle
I can still
poorly.
see it.
I've never seen
And
that
these are actually
problem.
just
At least
shifted
in
down.
2004.
Oh,
okay.
I was gonna say I've never had that problem.
Because I wrote that here, but I was looking
My
here.
dad-
I think my scanner will
Start it up and
pick
it's
it up as
cold,
very
and
faded,
it wants to
faded,
do this
13. It will still pick it up, but the scanner is actually pretty
Well,
good.
the program, the cool
Anyway,
program
I was
is
just pointing out
actually
that
higher.
Okay.
we're supposed to
than,
erase smart.
the
Okay.
normal idle.
And like
just because it has
these,
to
they're
launch
still in the wrong
out of
place,
order.
but they're actually
So that's part of
shifted
it.
down for some reason.
But it
I think
surges,
mine was just right.
it shouldn't surge.
Okay, I'll
It's
take
not that I actually
I
thought
think
we were
that it's
supposed to follow
because
those
they-
lines.
Okay,
You can
I'll
get,
take that into consideration.
They make what I use on my cars. They have this